Welcome to Ancestors. I'm your host, Scott Wilkinson. Today, we'll explore family records, the documents, photos, or diaries that can be found right in your own home or tucked away at your grandmother's house. So get that box from the attic, dust off that photo album, and begin your search. Family records really are the best place to start, and you may be surprised at what you find.
Family records are really exciting. Everyone has family records. That's what's the best part about them. The people who say, well, I don't know how to do genealogy, I don't live near the library, that's okay, because they have family records. They have records about their family, and many times they think, yeah, but it's about my family, and my family isn't very interesting. You'd be surprised all of the things that are in family records.
One of the most informative family records is a journal or diary. But for many people, the observations of everyday life just seem mundane and ordinary. However, these become the priceless recollections of a time and a place that otherwise would be forgotten. Here in Northern Ireland is just such a treasure, made by a local farmer with a few sheaves of ledger paper and a bottle of ink. James Harshaw lived by the toil of his hands and the harvest of his crops. His was an average life, except for the extraordinary fact that at a time when many farmers in Ireland were illiterate, James Harshaw kept a detailed daily account of the events of his life and those around him. His diaries would connect him to his descendants more than a century later. When Suzanne Ballard began the search for her Irish ancestors, she didn't even know the diaries existed. She started much simpler, with just a scrap of paper given to her by her grandmother.
Many years ago, I had some minimal interest in genealogy, and I started looking for my grandmother's father's birth record. He was born in 1864, and I knew that he was born in Ireland, and I knew that he was born in County Down, and that's basically all that my grandmother had told me. Just a few years before my grandmother died, we moved near her, and one day she was cleaning out some of her belongings, and she came to me and said, here's something from my father. And it was this little tiny slip of paper that her father had written in pencil on this yellowed piece of paper, and he had written down exactly the name of the townland that I needed to have in Ireland.
Sometimes we have the mistaken idea that we've got to leave home and go to some great record repository first off and hound the poor people there and try and get information. No, you start at home and you go in your house and your garage, your attic, and if you happen to have a basement, and check and see what's in the boxes.
I recommend to people that they just go around the house and start looking, and just seeing what's there with a different eye this time. Talking to relatives that live in the town you live in, relatives that live in other towns, and ask them what things have been saved, either in scrapbooks or memorabilia boxes or whatever. And sometimes you don't know what you'll find until you start looking.
Several years ago, I was at my grandmother's, and I had gone down to the basement and was going through boxes of old things, old books and everything, and I pulled out a book that I didn't recognize, and I opened it up, and it was the journal that my grandfather had kept in the early 1900s, just a day-to-day account of what he had done, and I was just blown away. I had no idea. I'd never seen it, never heard about it before, and I ran upstairs and I asked my grandmother, have you seen this before? Do you know about this? And she about fell over. I mean, she had no idea it existed.
Journals, account books, letters, old letters. You get insights into people's lives from letters like from nothing else. My husband and I did our courtship through correspondence. Excellent way to get to know somebody. Read their letters. The letter may give you an address. The letter may tell you of Great Aunt Matilda's third child being born and then dying. The journal may tell you the feelings that Great Aunt Matilda had when the baby died. Get anything that you have, your birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates if you've got them. They won't be yours, of course, but you'll find some. Photographs, samplers, all of these things together, because every one of them may contain a clue that will help you go into other records to really trace your ancestry.
The little piece of paper that I received from my grandmother had written on it not only the townlands and the county where my family was from, but it mentioned that her father had a famous uncle whose name was John Martin, who had been a member of Parliament for County Meath. So when I took it to the genealogical library, I went to the librarian. She took one look at that piece of paper and immediately took me to the who's who of who's who in Britain, and there he was, the famous uncle, the member of Parliament, telling me the exact same townland that was on my little piece of paper. Then I was able to go to the genealogical card catalog and discover that they had a book in the genealogy library, and it was written by a Reverend Cowan back in 1916. And he had stated that in there, that he had received a lot of the information about the Harshaws and about the Martins from the diaries of James Harshaw, who had kept a bound diary. I knew nothing about them, didn't know where they were at. It was like, where are these diaries? So then I went into the internet and I just typed in, does anybody know where I can locate the Harshaw Diaries? And some lady, I didn't even know her, she saw my little thing about the Harshaw Diaries, my query about that, and forwarded it to Marge Roby in Massachusetts.
Suzanne's internet research had introduced her to a distant cousin, Marjorie Harshaw Roby, who knew a great deal about James Harshaw and his diaries, which were written by candlelight in this house. Now, these diaries had been lost for over a century, but Marjorie had just discovered them.
After James Harshaw's death in 1867, the diaries were given to one of his sons who had immigrated to the United States. Through a series of events, the diaries ended up in the basement of a bank in Grove City, Pennsylvania, where they were forgotten for many years. In the late 1980s, they were nearly incinerated before a bank employee discovered them and thought they might be of some value to James Harshaw's descendants. Eventually, they were given to Marjorie Harshaw Roby.
Marge had the diaries and had just donated them to Ireland after being gone from Ireland for 100 years. And she, I was concerned because here they were in Ireland and I wanted to read them. But she had taken the James Harshaw Diaries to the New England Historic and Genealogical Society in Boston, and they had microfilmed the diaries. So they have the only microfilm copy in the entire United States of the Harshaw Diaries, other than the one that Marge Roby herself has. And so she had one copy and was brave enough to lend them to this distant cousin over in Washington State, clear across the United States. And I spent every single morning for about 3 months going to my local family history center and looking at them on microfilm and absolutely being enthralled with the diaries and all the wonderful things I could discover about my family. He began very sporadically at first. By 1840, he was writing every single day in the diaries. His writing skills are not great, but he just diligently, every night, by candlelight, exactly what had happened during the day. But in the course of keeping that history, he started recording all of the births, all of the deaths, all of the marriages of every single person he knew.
17th of July, 1847. A very wet morning till 9 o'clock. Mrs. Porter died this Sabbath. Twins were born in this day to Mary O'Neill of Tamarack.
If your ancestor is from the Southern County Down area and knew James Harshaw, then their records are in there as far as their births and their marriages and their deaths.
Now you're beginning to put, as the genealogists say, flesh on the bones, because you have the data, you have the information, but now you're making it a person. This is your ancestor.
It's difficult to express how valuable family records can be. Although diaries are one of the most intimate of family records, personal histories can be just as informative because they summarize the experiences and events that make up a person's life.
You might be fortunate enough to find a written history about what? About one of your ancestors. Either they wrote it themselves or somebody recorded it. It could be a chronology where they said, born this year, went to school this and then, and so on, or it could be quite a detailed one.
This person is telling you about his or her own life and is also describing relationships with others in the family, how they got along with their siblings, how they got along with their parents, And this is something that would mean more to you than all of the dates and all of the activities that may have happened.
My grandmother wrote a life story, or started to write one. She wrote for the first 18 years of her life. And reading her life story just brings her alive to me. It's like she's a personal friend, because I know what she was doing, what she was feeling, the hardships she faced. And she didn't finish the story, but for those first 18 years, I feel very close to her.
You have found some wonderful written material, and you're excited about it. But what does anyone look like? Don't you wish you had a photograph of somebody? Now, of course, when we go back far enough, and they're the old tintypes, and even farther than that, you're not going to find very much. But there's an awful lot of photographs around there that you don't know anything about.
You may remember yourself as a child that you liked to sit down and look at an album when you were a baby and as you were growing up. And there you are as a teenager, and as you get older and so on. Well, it's the same when you find a photo album of your ancestors. Here they are, they're real. You can finally put a face to a name.
I had a personal experience where I had been researching my great-grandfather. Never knew about my great-grandfather. Never knew his name, never knew he existed until I started doing genealogy 25 years ago. And I had learned about him from my grandmother because my grandfather was deceased when I started doing genealogy. So my grandmother told me a lot of things about him that she had learned from her husband. I started going into records and researching death certificates and census records and all kinds of records for my great-grandfather. And I don't know, I might have been researching him for several weeks, several months. Then all of a sudden we went down in the basement and my grandmother had a photo of him. Oh, it was just unbelievable. It's, you always had these visions of what they look like. Then all of a sudden when you see these photos, it's like they come to life.
In the American West, you would see photographs with the horse or a cow and the dog. Everything is in that photograph because it was precious to the entire family. And everybody came out, even if Granny was unhappy about it and would duck her head a bit. But they're all there. Everything is there. And there's a little time capsule in that photograph.
There are also some pictures that have no name on them at all. That is one of the worst things that could happen to a genealogist. Just the picture you want and you don't know who it is.
I found a photograph that did not have names attached to it, but I had other photos that were identified, and I can compare them with the other photo and identify a couple of people that are in the photo. I've compared photographs with census records, and I know when a photograph was taken based on the ages of the individuals, compare that with the census, knowing what ages people are in the census, and can figure out who some of the relationships of people are in the photograph by comparing that with census records and other records. Also, I recommend that people take photographs and show them to relatives, and have relatives try to identify the people in the photograph.
In 1997, Suzanne, her husband, and her son were invited to come to Ireland for the dedication of a new headstone to be placed on the grave of James Harshaw.
That's when Marge indicated to me that there was going to be a rededication of the gravestone, of a new gravestone for James Harshaw in Ireland in March of 1997. And would I like to come along? And the desire was overwhelming to go to Ireland. She had already met the relatives over there. I wanted to meet them. I wanted to meet the people that I was related to. I wanted to see the homeland. I wanted to be there so bad, and I didn't have the money for it. And my mother, bless her heart, provided three round-trip tickets for myself and my son and my husband to go to Ireland for 3 weeks. The Harshaws welcomed us with open arms there, and it was overwhelming. It was just really neat to meet all these Harshaw relatives. And they all just started coming out of the woodwork, and we got to meet all of them and some others that had related to some of the other children of James Harshaw, and they were all there for the dedication of the gravestone. I walked in the home that my great-grandfather was born in County Wexford. I walked in the home that my great-great-grandfather was born in, and actually the ruins of the home that he was born in Loughorn in County Down. And I walked in the home that my great-great-great-grandmother, Jane Harshaw, and her brother James Harshaw, the diarist, were born in, that was built by my fourth great-grandfather, James Harshaw I, over 200 years ago.
When searching for family records, one source often leads to another. Just like Suzanne's little scrap of paper led to the Harshaw Diaries, the diaries led her to another important record, an old family Bible. It was in the attic of a distant cousin in Toronto.
I was able to call him on the phone, and through a whole series of wonderful communications back and forth with him, was finally able to receive some Xeroxes of the genealogical facts out of the Bible, the family Bible, which, by the way, provided about 6 or 7 more children that I did not have prior to that.
Family Bibles are a rich treasure trove of family history, obviously because they centered on pages that specifically asked for information about births, marriages, and deaths. And to a genealogist, of course, those are prime records that we are interested in.
The Bible was often given as a wedding gift. And so here was the marriage of the couple, and then as the children came along, they were recorded. And then as the children died, they were recorded. And there are stories in there. The joyful occasion of the birth of the first child, and then a year later it died of a fever. And you know how they struggled to save that child, but it still died. And if that family Bible was lost and gone, all of that would be gone too.
I had got a copy of my family Bible from back in the middle 1700s, and I made photocopies of the Bible, and I have it. But to see it in handwriting by my grandparents on dates of birth of people and deaths in their handwriting, and when you see it, you feel it.
When we find something like a family Bible or a diary, we're filled with appreciation to our ancestors who kept these records. But are we doing the same for our own descendants? It's important for us to realize that however boring we think our own lives are, a few decades from now, someone else will be just as interested in us.
I think oftentimes we try to make family history too complex. We don't think of the simple things that we can do to preserve our family history for posterity. Something so simple as keeping a diary or a journal on a daily basis. Suddenly the things that to us are mundane, to our posterity will be an enriching part of their lives to understand what we were doing from day to day.
But I found even putting a chronology down helps, that I was born at a certain time in a certain place, and I went to school certain years at certain schools, and I went from this country to that country, and at least get that sort of thing down. So there are advantages to doing something, and something is better than nothing.
Those people that have never kept a diary or a journal before, they need to really think about that. I mean, I really wish I had kept one when I was in high school or when I first started doing genealogy. They're very important.
My name is Leonard Harshaw, and I'm the great-great-great-grandson of the diarist James Harshaw. And my father has kept a diary as long as I can remember, and as far as I know, from he was about 14, 15 years of age, he's been keeping a diary, and he's now 84. And in turn, I have kept a diary as well from I was about 9, 10 years of age. I have kept a diary. It's just in my blood to go ahead and do it, and I feel that every day, you know, that I must get this diary filled in, and it's done day and daily, and I wouldn't miss doing it for anything. Even if when I go on holidays, I take the diary with me.
I type my journal daily on the computer and print it out and bind it, as did James Harshaw, because I feel it's something that my children might enjoy reading someday about what I went through.
One of the most moving passages in James Harshaw's diaries was the account of the death of his sister Jane, who was Suzanne's great-great-great-grandmother. And those events, well, they took place in this very house.
I got to read about the death of my great-great-great-grandmother, Jane Harshaw Martin, his sister, and how he was so upset at her death, and he described her death. July 16th, 1847. Rose after 3 o'clock and visited my sister.
Found her very weak. Kissed her brow. David Martin read the 17th chapter of John's Gospel. I prayed. Her breathing continues very calm and countenance very placid and mild. The last enemy seems very near, but disarmed of his usual terrors. Her lamp burns quietly out, like the sun in the western sky on a clear, mild evening in the month of July. She sleeps now, the dreamless sleep of death. After life's fitful fever, she sleeps well.
It was just phenomenal. And every day, reading these things and crying and weeping with joy to be able to finally find out so much information about these ancestors who so desperately wanted to be found.
You know, not everybody's going to have a diary or a journal that's going to just make their lives and make the research so much easier. But everybody is going to have something. It could be a small piece of paper that you find tucked away in a drawer, or perhaps in a scrapbook in somebody's handwriting that leads you to another record. It could be a notation on the back of a photograph. It could be perhaps a confirmation certificate that shows they attended a certain church at a certain time period in a city you weren't aware that they ever lived in. All of these little hints will help you put your ancestors' life together.
Whether it's a little scrap of paper or a diary, family records are a great place to start, and they provide such wonderful insights into your ancestors' lives. And that's what it's all about, discovering your family and connecting with your ancestors.
Because my grandmother gave me that one little piece of paper, I was able to take and my line and my genealogy back on a female line of all things, which is almost impossible and unheard of. So far back, because James Harshaw kept a diary, a daily diary, thinking it was only good for himself and maybe for his own children, not even thinking, I'm sure, that there was any value to anyone else in the world. But that one little act of keeping a diary has been so important to those of us as descendants to see those records and to see what is available. Imagine what my life would be like without having had that one little piece of paper. I'd never know about these people. I would never be able to make the connection to them. How important it is for us all to keep track of our records, because we never know what our one little piece of information is not going to help somebody else or touch another life somewhere along the way.
Next time on Ancestors, we'll learn about compiled records, and we'll meet Sheila Shaw from mainland China, whose family had been keeping records for thousands of years. But had their genealogy survived China's devastating cultural revolution?
The Red Guards searched around the country, destroyed thousands of cultural items. But these records were safely buried under the ground.